truly an honor to be giving the Tinbergen lecture, and this, the 50th anniversary of his Nobel Prize. And I think I want to really focus on issues where he was the true leader in setting the standard, both conceptually and empirically, in thinking about the key role of human capital and technological change, both in long-run economic growth. He was one of the sort of discoverers of the residual in economic growth and the important role of human capital, and in understanding the distribution of income, which culminated in his important work in the 1970s on what he called the race between access to education and technological development, that we sort of shortened in others to the race between education and technology. And what I want to talk about today is really extending the race between education and technology in multiple directions. And in many sense, this slide sort of tells Claudia Golden and I have worked on this for a very long time, and a culmination of our historical work on the U.S. was the book in 2008, which was truly inspired by Tinbergen. And how I want to extend the discussion today is broadly in four directions. First, that book focused mainly on the 20th century and late 19th century, a very long time period, but improvements in data collection, and that all of us get older and time passes on. We now have the 21st century, at least close to the first fifth, and we can push things back further in the 19th, and I'm going to talk about the relevance of this framework for understanding very long-term changes in inequality. Second, there's been a number of recent contributions by people I tremendously respect. Some of my former students like David Otter and people like Daron Acemoglu have argued that there are a lot of limitations to the sort of what they call the generic model, the Tinbergen framework of race between education and technology. And I want to argue that while there are limitations, there are also a lot of strengths, and in some sense, much of the new contributions really fit very much into this framework as providing stronger micro foundations for sort of the technology terms inside the race between education and technology model. So I want to push forward on that. And third, much of the progress in the last decade in labor economics in many parts have been the growth of large administrative data sets. And it's allowed us, I will argue, to sort of push the frontier in understanding the role of market forces and sort of person effects versus the role of sort of institutions, and is actually helping. I think one can link the growth of matched employer-employee, AKM, Aboud, Kramar's, Margolis models that try to separate out person effects from sort of firm and institutional effects in a very systematic way that both shows it still remains the most important factors are these sort of persistent person effects related to education, but important components of how technological change and institutional factors affect the distribution of who works with what firms. And much of the growth of inequality in recent decades is the growing sorting of more highly educated and elite workers into the types of firms that offer higher wage premia. And finally, in the period that Tinbergen was writing, the stability of labor's share of national income was sort of the stylized fact of the day, often credited to Nikki Kaldor. So much of the focus, which still is super important, was the distribution of income within labor and the role of education. But starting in the 1980s in much of Europe and in the 2000s in the United States, we've seen substantial declines in labor's share of national income. And I will argue that a lot of this is can be thought of in a framework very similar to the way we're thinking of capital and different groups of labor, like the different groups of labor in the Tinbergen framework, and that the sort of type of microanalysis that's been seen in modern work can also apply, and that it's very much tied up to the growth of what we call superstar large firms and growing concentration of product markets in very many places, and to the fact that large superstar firms, which have what we might call scale bias, technical change, new investments in IT in ways to sort of economize of use of labor, growing intangible capital, play a very big role in the decline of labor share, and that it's not actually something that's happening in the typical firm. So that's the, given time, hopefully I will get through each of these. So where I want to start is basically to extend the work that Tinbergen did in the mid-20th century and that we did sort of covering the full 20th century to look at very long-run changes in wage structure. In particular, we've been able, through work with my economic historian collaborator Robert Margo at Boston University, and the work Claudia Golden and I have done, push forward, I think, a reasonably consistent series of education/skill differentials of wages in the US over 2 centuries. And what you can see is much of the focus recently has been in this substantial period since 1980 of the growing college wage premium, which you can see in the blue graph right there. The college premium has sort of doubled in the last several decades in the US. And this is very much connected to overall growth and sort of inequality. If you look at the 90-10, you look at the Gini coefficient, and most famously in recent work by Piketty and Saez, Saez and Zuckman, Piketty, Saez and Zuckman, Saez and Zuckman, and their collaborators is the increasingly important share of national income, particularly in the United States, much more so than in Europe, going to the very, very upper part here, the top 1%. And what I want you to see in 3 different graphs is, even though these are not all the same phenomenon, a very similar historical pattern. Tremendous, very high inequality, whether it's the top 1% share or the sort of college premium or high school premium in the early 20th century. Great narrowing in World War I and World War II, and then a lot of stability in the mid-20th century, whether it's top-end shares or it's educational wage differentials, and then an explosion of inequality in all these dimensions since 1980. And so while the college and high school wage premium are not all of inequality, they very much trace the broad pattern of changes in inequality. And if we look at the different eras, one question you might ask is, it's pretty clear where I can estimate college wage differentials and high school wage differentials since the mid-20th century. We have household survey data, representative samples where we've been able to do this in most countries. How do I know what the premium of wages was in the 19th century? It turns out in the United States, and I'm sure it's true in many countries, there was one really large employer who kept very meticulous records of the characteristics of the workers they hired and what their earnings were, which was the U.S. military had forts all over the United States, and they kept records of what they paid for a clerical worker, what they paid for a laborer, an artisan, and what you can see, and this is going to stick, was in the 19th century, we also saw both the rise of robber barons and a rise of income inequality at the top end, but we also saw this growing divide between workers who had access to high school and could become clerical workers and workers who didn't, who worked as production workers. That was a growing differential over much of the 19th century with industrialization, the expansion of large firms with steam power, eventually with electrical power. And the striking thing, unlike the parts of the early 20th century and mid-20th century, is we weren't building sort of high schools in the US, so there were a lot of growth of private academies, but access to education was very much behind the growth of demand for schooling, and you see these rising differentials. Once we started building, creating what became the modern secondary school, access to this, what Paul Douglas, the great economist of the early 20th century US, called non-competing groups between those who had gone to high school and could become clerical workers and others, greatly diminished. And you see this substantial narrowing of the high school wage premium and the gap between clerical and production workers, which we can measure consistently over 150 years, and the college divide also narrowing as more people had access to high school and could gain access to college. You then see a lot of balance in the mid-20th century with rapid growth of educational attainment and very stable wage structure, everyone sharing in sort of prosperity. And then you see this widening inequality since on all these measures. And how I'm going to sort of interpret this, and the one other thing to sort of note in this little thing is, in the period of widening inequality in the US, there's sort of two sub-periods. There was a brief period in the 1980s where every dimension of inequality just blew up. From 1980 to 87, the bottom sort of collapsed relative to the middle collapsed relative to the 90th percentile, the 90th relative to the top. Since then, since the late 80s, it's very much a phenomenon of the college and greater than college divide growing, and the upper end. The bottom half has been very, very stable. So the erosion of the minimum wage, something that Kuhn Tulling's work was very important in the 1980s in the US, but things have been very stable. Everyone's done really poorly in the bottom half of the distribution, but not that different in the middle or the bottom, whereas the college and then greater than college divide has really been growing. And so how do I interpret, following Tinbergen, these very broad patterns of wage structure changes? I will argue you go pretty far to understanding the long-run changes in these different periods by a world in which there's pretty strong and consistent increased demand for higher education through technological change, whether it was electrification in the early 20th century, the development of transport and infrastructure sections, and improved automation in the mid-20th century, computerization, artificial intelligence recently. What's really varied at different points of time have been both the access to education. In the 19th century, when there were big fixed costs to going to high school, you didn't see expansion keeping up with demand, and you see widening inequality. Whereas in the early and mid-20th century, large increases in access to schooling narrowed and then kept in place these sorts of differentials. And the big acceleration of the high school movement and big slowdown in the recent period really seem very important. There are a lot of subtleties here, and in the recent period, the nature of technological change has been impacting the middle, but that's not that different than the 19th century, when the shift from the artisanal shop to sort of the steam engine and then electrical power really eliminated what had been really good, less educated jobs that required a lot of artisanal sort of skills and craft work. Is very similar to the decline of middle skill jobs, whether it's production jobs or clerical and middle management in the recent period. And one needs to get a full story to bring in wage-setting institutions that are always important. And in the US in the 80s, the erosion of the minimum wage, unions more recently, and this sort of growing sorting that the new employer-employee match data is going to allow us to get of who works with what firms has become very important, and is more important in the 2000s than it had been previously. So this is the other very long-term graph I can provide you with, which is the growth of educational attainment of the typical US-born worker. You'd see similar things in many countries of the world, but not as sharp a slowdown. And what you can see is every generation of US-born individuals from the late 19th century went from sort of having common schooling 7 or 8 years if you were born late in the 19th century to having access to high school in the early 20th century to having access to college and post-secondary schooling in the mid-20th century. So everyone basically had a year and a half, 2 more years of schooling on average than their parents for people born over close to a century. Today's Americans are the most educated cohort we've ever seen, but the rate of growth of expansion of access to education has slowed down dramatically, so that a 30-year-old today has a few tenths of a year more of schooling than their parents, whereas a 30-year-old 40 years ago had 2 years more schooling than their parents. What that's meant is the rate of growth of the relative supply of more educated workers has really slowed down dramatically, very much in line with that widening of the college premium. So in the mid to 20th century up to the 80s, we were getting about 4% a year growth in the relative supply of highly educated workers. It's still growing, but at about half the rate in the recent period. If you imagine a world where the demand for highly educated workers grows closer to 4% a year, in a world where supply grows 4%, it's very different than a world where supply grows at sort of 2%. So that's been a very big change that we'll argue that's important. And when you look at the rise of sort of inequality, it's striking how much it shows up along education lines and at the end where sort of supply, where demand is sort of moving up. In the early 20th century, it's really high school is the divide. In the mid-20th century, college. Increasingly, it's people with graduate training. And if you look at this graph, you can see in the 80s, the college group, the top 2 lines sort of divide from everyone, but in the post-2000 era, it's actually people with greater than college training, the high blue that have gone off in outer space. And among men, people with less than college schooling actually have declining real wages in the United States pretty consistently. And if you ask that overall growth in inequality in the US, and earnings, the variance of earnings, you could do the 90-10, 95-10 Gini, went up about 50%. So there's been a massive increase in inequality, about a 50% growth of the variance since 1980. And just applying, if you held everything else constant in the labor force and just applied the observed differences in returns to schooling at different levels, you essentially explain about 60% of that growth of inequality. The others basically being what's happening among the highly educated, growing inequality. If you go to a particular college and get a job in an investment bank, you're going to do a lot better. If you're a teacher, that's the other very big part. And among the non-college group, there's really not much change. There's this middle and bottom, which very much seem to be going together. And so education continues to be a very big part of understanding what's going on, at least in the bottom, 99% of the workforce. There's clearly also this very large shift that I showed you at the very top in the US, which is more extreme than most other countries. There's been a lot of attention paid to the work, deservedly, of Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman of growing wealth and income inequality at the very top, but how large is sort of these education differentials in the big scheme of things in terms of national income relative to what's going on in the very top? And what I would argue is they're both very important forces. So if we take the sort of 1980 to the 2010s growth of the top 1%, and you can imagine, that in the US is massive. It's about 12.5% of national income or GDP. If you imagine, and I don't have a policy to do this, maybe Elizabeth Warren does, but if you could magically redistribute that income without changing the level of income, found a way of taking that 12.5%, imagine giving it to the bottom 99%, the bottom 90%, giving it to non-college workers. It's real stuff. If we gave it to the bottom 90%, the 90% would have 28% more income than average. So the growth of inequality at the top end is a really, really big deal in the U.S. data. I mean, that's like over 30 years, everyone having 1% more real wage growth per year. So this is a huge phenomenon. But the growing education divide is also a very similar big divide in the U.S. and many countries, and where people live and what's going on. And the gap for a full-time, full-year worker between a college graduate and a high school graduate, even after netting out the fact that college is not free in the U.S., that it has a cost, is the raw data without taking into account the opportunity costs and cost of college look much bigger than the 1% redistribution, but it's quite comparable. It's something like $10,000 a year per individual college, not the sort of value of the permanent income increase. So for a couple, it's actually quite a bit larger than redistributing. And obviously, the extent to which human capital investments are productive, we're also getting sort of growth dividends from that. So while this in no way undercuts the importance of growing top-end inequality, the impacts on political economy of growing wealth at the top end are very different than changes in the college divide. In terms of the overall scheme of things, the extent to which the college gap is sort of well explained and helpful by sort of the Tinbergen framework, it's at least as big a deal for the typical family as what's going on at the very top end of the distribution, even in the United States, which has the most extreme changes at the very top end. And then the final descriptive fact to sort of plate this is, one thing I noted in 1980 to 1987, we see this big increase both in the sort of 95, 50, so leaving out the very, very high end as well as top 1%, and in the 50-10. That is a period when the nominal minimum wage in the U.S. stayed constant for a decade. But since then, if anything, the real problems have been the collapse in the middle versus the bottom, and the 50-10 wage differential is actually narrower today in the United States than it was in the late 80s, whereas what's happening in the upper half, the college greater than college divide, and what's happening just keeps on chugging along now for 40 years, from the late 70s to the 2000s. Nothing seems to derail the 95th and above from sort of moving ahead of the middle in the United States. So how do we think about combining these sort of quantity data on education with the sort of price data on wage differentials? And here, I'm going to give a simple interpretation of Tinbergen's canonical, race between education and technology, and thinking about a production function really at the aggregate that combines, we can add in physical capital. For now, I'm going to ignore it. It's actually going to come in through these technology terms, combines college and high school labor, let's think, in some imperfect substitutable way, defined by this parameter rho, of which 1 over 1 minus rho turns out to be the elasticity of substitution. And if we think of this as an aggregate, it's both going to combine true production function substitutability between different workers, but also the extent to which consumers can substitute between high skill and low skill sort of products and goods also shows up there. And what I'm going to think about is two types of technological change. Traditional Herod-neutral technological change, which is the A's and the B's terms. We can think about A going up makes college workers more productive at doing the tasks they're doing, and B going up is making high school workers more productive at the tasks they're doing. We call that intensive skill bias technological change. It's making you better. And that's the traditional way economic growth thinks about technological change, because it's sort of consistent with fixed labor share over the long run, which was a fact about the mid-20th century. It's not actually a fact of the 19th century or a fact about the 21st century in the US or the late 20th century, but that's the reason why most things do. But it's also very easy to add in essentially what you might call extensive margin technological change. This alpha term, which you can think of as shifting the share of tasks that highly educated workers do relative to less educated workers because of technological change. And these are going to be they're going to show up in a relative wage equation as very much the same, but they have very different implications. A standard model of A and B going up, their ratio is sort of the skill bias, but all of it should raise the wages of everybody because it's making us all more productive. Whereas if I'm taking away things you used to do, automating it, shifting it to a different group of workers, I can actually have the type of pattern we saw of declining real wages for less educated workers, which is what we've been seeing in the United States. And I also can end up with what the fact is, unlike when you're thinking about labor and capital, it's not like the share in national income of what college versus non-college workers have been constant. There's been a massive increase in the share of national income, going to highly educated workers versus less educated workers. So the sort of traditional framework really doesn't sort of capture that without having, without putting a lot of restrictions on the elasticity of substitution. And so this is sort of the framework I think about. You can turn this into the type of estimating equation that Tinbergen did in his studies, essentially looking at relative wages of more versus less educated workers on relative supply and on demand shifts, which he called the rate of growth of technology. So think about this equation 4 here, which is sort of like an estimating equation. What we're going to see is changes, the relative wage of more versus less educated worker depends on whether demand is going faster than supply or whether technology, the DT term is the sum of those A over B and alpha over 1 minus alpha terms, is racing faster than education. That's why he called this the race between education and technology. The extent that there are deviations, it's going to change the relative wage basically on how steeply sloped or how flat the labor demand curve is, which is defined by the aggregate elasticity of substitution. And, it's going to be driven by things like, major innovations that change DT, but also access to schooling. And we will argue that you do a pretty good job, as he did, in seeing that it's been variation in the rate of growth of these relative supplies of education that have played a very important role in explaining the changes in the college wage premium and the high school wage premium before it. And if you let this rip on US data for as long as we have consistent data from sort of 1914 to 2017, you get something. I here just give smooth time trends and some potential changes. I can stick an index of industry and occupational changes, and I'll get very similar sort of findings. What you see is a very well-defined negative 0.5, 0.6, 0.7 coefficient. What that means is a 10% increase in the relative supply of college workers tends to reduce the relative wage of 6%. The college supply has been going up a ton over time, but the relative wage, it fell in the sort of early 20th century mid. That's when it's going much faster than this demand going up. But when the supply slows down, as in recent sort of decades, that ongoing sort of trend in demand pushes the college premium higher. And basically, what you can see is you do a pretty good job of allowing slow-moving trends or indexes of change, of predicted change of different types of workers or technology indicators. I could stick in the relative price of electricity and computers and do very much the same. And there are 2 periods where the model doesn't do very well. It clearly can't explain the compression of World War II era. There was certainly institutions, wage and price controls, an incredibly tight labor market that, the reason there was a massive collapse in the college premium and overall inequality were direct sort of intervention in the labor market, not, some big deviation of the race between education and technology. And in the US, there was a last gasp of strong unions in the late 1970s in a high inflation period where they really pushed up wages of high school graduates. So there's a big disconnect in the late 1970s, but sort of since then, things sort of move pretty well. You do pretty, the Tinbergen framework does a very nice job of explaining the long run trends. And if you think about this. The supply curve was sort of moving out about 4% a year in the mid-20th century. It's now moving out about 2% a year. This sort of model implies that the demand curve is not that different in its rate of going out, but it leads to very different implications for the wage structure changes when supply is slowed down. If you push this thing out to 2017, the rate of growth of the college premium is much slower than it was, and that's because there actually has been some, in the last decade, 15 years, we have accelerated a little bit access to education in the US and improvement, and there's been some continuing slowdown, despite the view that everyone thinks technological change is getting faster. You don't see that either in the relative, neither in the productivity data nor in the sort of relative demand indices or shifts across industries or occupation have been slowing down modestly. So why do I call that demand part skill bias technological change? I can stick in indicators for it, but I think there are several reasons why we think Tinbergen was onto something and calling it. One logical level, we see firms within firms and within plants, large increases, if you use the microdata, in their use of more educated workers, even though the relative price of more educated workers is going up. And so we're going to call that, essentially some change in sort of technology if you're producing the same thing. And we can do that looking within product lines. And we see very similar patterns of within sector skill upgrading across sort of similar sectors in the US. And we have a very hard time fully explaining the absorption of more educated workers by, any index of the historical difference of the education within product classes over time. It looks like in every sort of product class, you're shifting to highly educated labor versus others, and you're doing that despite it being more expensive. We also have a lot of more direct evidence, some correlational between indicators of where you see bigger shifts towards the more educated and the use of new technologies, whether it's what happens when you bring in numerical machine tools into the valve industry, what happens when banks gain scanners and ATMs. They don't have to hire as many high school graduate tellers, but they still hire a lot of college graduate customer service representatives who no longer process routine transactions, but try to sell you products to improve your savings, or at least, or possibly to fool you that some product doesn't have risk when it actually does have risk. But in terms of labor demand, we call that skill upgrading. It's not clear it's a productivity improvement, but it is a skill bias technological change. So we see that many compelling case studies, whether it's auto repair and the need to sort of know electronics now, valve or steel. And we see natural experiments where, when you introduce broadband, staggered across regions in Norway, tax cuts for investment in information technology in Britain, bizarre Medicare reimbursement changes in the United States where some hospitals have big incentives to sort of invest in things like MRIs and magnetic scanners because they get big reimbursements, and other ones are at the cap, so they have no incentives to change that. Or whether you look at the recent work that I know Doron Osamoglu has spoken here about, places that had the infrastructure for robots or not, you find when the sort of cost of new technology goes, not only do jobs get automated, but it's done in a way that reallocates labor share towards the more highly educated, and in recent years carves out sort of the middle. So the strength of this sort of framework is it operationalizes with sort of observable measures of supply and demand for skills. It's very flexible. The constant elasticity of substitution production function can be expanded up and down through nesting it in a very simple way. You can add in age group, substitution, experience group. You can make the education groups have different groups. If you think college and greater than college are more closely substitutable, substitutable than the college-high school divide and high school and less than. You can integrate it in. You can bring in capital either directly as an input or think about those technology terms as capturing the reduced form effects of things like robots or artificial intelligence. And it's shown to be very useful for explaining within-country changes, but also cross-country differences. There's a lot of institutional factors, but the relative supply and demand shifts, explain particularly in the upper half of the distribution, 90-50 gaps, a lot of the cross-country. There's a lot more institutional stuff happening at the very bottom of the labor market with minimum wages and stuff relative to the education side when you get there. Limitations that people have pointed out. If you literally want to call it, if I held myself constant and took the equation I estimated using Tinbergen in 1992 and forecasted that today, I underpredict the growth of the college premium. The trend, you need to, get the trend slowing down. I think there are logical reasons for it. It actually does pretty good for the next, 10 years, but it does pretty poorly for the period after that. That's pretty good in a prediction model. And so I think people like David Otter and Doron Acemoglu argue there are other things going on. And I think this sort of polarization of employment, which you see the decline in the middle since the 1970s and 80s across middle occupations declining in the U.S. and in Europe, is an important amendment to this framework that the demand at greater than college continues taking off in the top end of college, but a lot of the parts that new information technology are able to substitute for are what used to be middle management jobs, what used to be clerical college jobs, and high-end production jobs of high school graduates. And so the convexification of returns to education, this growing premium for greater than college and polarization, you need to modify it, but I think is a friendly amendment to this sort of framework. The real concerns with using repeated cross-section data that maybe the composition of who are in different education groups when you have massive changes is changing, and you're fooling yourself to thinking this is a human capital price effect and it's really changing of selection. Selection goes in both directions. As education goes up, the more educated become less selective, and the less educated group becomes less selective because the upper part. So it's not obvious which direction it goes. I think there are three sources of evidence that make me, able to sleep at night and not worry this is the main thing. I find the two most compelling is that if you look at people who are already past education within cohorts, something that Kevin Murphy did, and you look at what's happened to the relative wages of more educated, less educated as people go from age 30 to 40, 40 to 50, 50 to 60, decade to decade, it very much lines up with these cross-section estimates. In the 1980s, you see a much bigger growth in the gap between a college-educated 40-year-old to a high school 40, them growing from 30 to 40. Then you looked in the 1970s when the college premium is falling. So within cohort stuff looks almost identical to the repeated cross-section. And then we have a lot of really good natural experiment evidence of what happens on the margin when you let people into higher education. Work, for example, by Seth Zimmerman in the US. What if you, where we have regression discontinuities where on the margin, some people who look just like others get into a state university and you find rates of return of like 13, 14% a year that look a lot in recent periods like the returns estimated from the sort of Tinbergen approach. And if you did this in parts of Europe where the gaps look much smaller, you get much smaller marginal returns. And if you did this in the 1970s and 80s in the US before the big increase, you get much smaller ones. So I think there's something that we really are picking up these price changes. But I'd say clearly this is not everything. I think a lot of the recent work on robots, artificial intelligence, and polarization really are ways of micro-founding what is that alpha term of technological change and things that are shifting the share of tasks done by other groups. And I view that as really the modern extension of Tinbergen's model. But, I think you really need to extend it to think about institutions as well, and think about the overall labor share as an important. And that's where I want to finish up today. I've often thought about the Tinbergen model as sort of being the supply and demand shocks portion of understanding wage structure changes, but there are really two other important parts. Their interactions, every country has a different set of wage setting institutions, and so the same shock from technology will have a very different impact. If you have a very strong minimum wage, on the bottom versus not, or you have a very strong collective bargaining in the middle. And institutional changes themselves, the erosion of the minimum wage in the US, the decline in unions are very important. And I don't think it's worth going into a lot of detail, but you can think of essentially the actual wage we see of any worker as combining the latent Tinbergian market clearing wage that's not observable necessarily, and some relative rent term, anything that leads to deviation, frictions, institutions from it. And you can imagine actual wage changes being decomposed into the sort of market supply and demand component across different groups, and a bunch of institutional factors. Think of unions, industry or firm rents, minimum wages, and you can imagine trying to decompose these changes into the part you can measure as the sort of supply and demand and these institutionals. Old style approach that I used to do before we had really good administrative data would be to sort of do the sort of graph I showed you. Let's see how far I can go with supply and demand, look at the anomalous periods, and then search for institutions that help me understand that. Another way to do would be to run a let-it-rip time series or cross-country regression that throws in all these things, and those give sort of similar results, but it's hard to sort of really conceptually justify what you're understanding. The more, what I think is really cool in extending sort of Tinbergen is our availability now of large-scale administrative data where we match employers and employees across firms allows us in some level to extract the long-run person component that you might think is related to sort of what you get in your outside option as we're observing people moving across different firms, and extract the sort of rent components that come with different employers or employer occupation groups by observing people switching between higher and low-wage employers. And that's what much work has been doing in the United States and Germany, Portugal, with these large matched employer-employee data sets where you can decompose wages in longitudinal data into a worker and firm effect. And what's striking from this literature in every country that we've sort of now seen this is that sort of person, the usual spin is, look, firms matter, and that's absolutely true in institutions, but another way to look at it is by far the biggest component, if we do this decomposition in the United States, is sort of the variance of WFE, which is the worker fixed effects, which is most of the variation, 70%, and it's sort of 70% of the growth of inequality in the US. So there's been a very big growth. That's what's striking is it very much looks like my household data decomposition of the role of the returns to education. The person effects explain about 70% of the growth of inequality. That's true in the US. It's almost the same in Germany, very similar in Portugal. And you can really explain in the US most of that with this education return. But what you're left with, while there's been a lot of pushing of this growing divergence of between firm variance. So a lot of papers have argued, and it's a fact, that much of the growth of inequality in wages is high-wage firms expanding versus low-wage firms. What we're finding out from the matched employer-employee data is that most of that is the fact that we start with a high degree of segregation between high elite and educated workers and others. So anything that makes the education divide grow will make between firm wage inequality grow if you start out with a fairly segregated workforce where highly educated workers work in law firms, less educated workers work in janitorial service firms. It will look like a between firm effect, even though it's picking up the person effects. But the second thing that's going on is we used to be in a world where a lot of ordinary workers shared in the sort of productivity and rents of very high-wage firms. And what's happened over time, you can see in the US, is the variance of firm effects themselves has not changed very much, but who gets them has increasingly shifted towards more educated and more elite workers. So about a third of the growth of inequality is this rising sorting that, it used to be you could be a janitor or a production worker and work for the elite General Motors or be the janitor at Goldman Sachs in the US or a large bank. Today, increasingly, think about an Apple or a Facebook. They're not, their janitors are hired from a janitorial service firm. Their food service people are coming in and working for a company. They're not getting the premium. Same thing if you look at Daimler and Germany, a very large increase in what we've called the fissuring of the labor market and the sort of outsourcing both domestically and internationally of tasks that improvements in information technology allow you to sort of monitor, or where you can get out of sort of paying a union wage premium or a high firm wage premium with improvements in ability to monitor these. And so we see this both directly in looking at the sort of contracting out, whether it's janitors in the US or food service workers in Germany in recent work. And we see this, through these sort of decompositions. And there are sort of policies, stuff I actually worked on at Harvard in sort of allowing outsourcing, but sort of trying to sort of say you have to pay the internal wages, or extensions of contracts, which have declined in a lot of European countries that can sort of mute some of the inequality increasing forces of this fissuring by sort of having the wage be more set at the original employer one without sort of disconnecting the fact that there may be very good productivity reasons of doing this sort of outsourcing, but it shouldn't be a source of sort of pushing down only on labor costs, and that seems possible. And then the other thing that's very much linked with this sort of change, let me sort of move forward, is that the successful firms, both have increasingly more highly educated and elite employees, and they're also giving a larger and larger share of it to shareholders rather than the employees. And so the final part of extending the race between education and technology is some work I've been doing with David Otter, David Dorn, Christina Patterson, and John von Reenen on the fall of labor share, particularly in the US, but similar patterns in many countries, although the timing is slightly different, and what we call the rise of superstar firms. So this is labor share of national income in the US. You can see very stable over much of the mid to late 20th century, substantial collapse in the 2000s with about a 5 percentage point decline in labor share, a little recovery, but not close to where it was, say, in the 1970s or the 1960s today. Very similar patterns starting earlier in many other countries seen around the world after stability in the mid-20th century. And at the same time, we see a massive growth in the importance of very large employers, both overall sales, but also industry by industry. If you look inside every 4-digit industry in the United States, on average, you see rising concentration of the 4 biggest firms, the 20 biggest firms, much bigger in manufacturing for sales and value added than employment. So this is scale without mass. Facebooks and Apple don't employ a ton of people, but they account for a lot of value added in growing like crazy. And things like retail, they sort of tend to go together. Walmart grows like crazy, but it hires a lot of workers, but relative to its, but it has a lot of growing markups from its improved efficiency. And so there's been this very large change in labor share is now an important component, obviously emphasized by people like Piketty and the growing sort of, shift to profit share. And we want to sort of understand that in a framework thinking about sort of technological change and the advantages to sort of large firms if they're big fixed costs of introducing new information technology. And what you find is if you decompose this in the, one explanation is it's just, there's a greater than one elasticity of substitution between labor and capital, and the price of sort of capital has been falling. Well, we've been having prices of capital falling for a long time, so you need some story why computers or robots are different than all sorts of earlier big improvements in technology that reduce this, and now there's sort of a change. Trade exposure could play a role. We find that's not that important. It's very important in displacing labor, but not much in changing labor share. What we find is that it's really the large firms growing who have always had lower labor share, and the large firms themselves changing who've been investing large time in new information technology. Think of an Amazon, think of a Walmart that's really driving it. And so we have offered, in a world of winner-take-most competition where the big guys have lower labor share, you can explain a whole lot of this. And looking at the micro-establishment data and firm data in the US and across the OECD, we find a consistent finding that a bunch of different reasons have favored sort of large superstar firms. Platform competition, clearly an important one. What you might call the Google effect, the Walmart effect. If you can invest in a better information technology, reduce your inventory costs as a retailer, you can expand relative to others. There's an alternative hypothesis, which I think ex post is quite important, and which Thomas Philippon is focused, which we used to have really rigorous antitrust enforcement, now we don't. I think very similar patterns in Europe, where antitrust enforcement has been very much larger in the US, suggests that's not the only thing going on. Walmart didn't expand only because there isn't antitrust enforcement. There were, and somehow earlier grocery stores didn't know it, but there's a lot of others, and there's sort of tougher international competition may give an advantage to what used to be former local monopolies in investing in this sort of new IT. And where I want to conclude is there's a whole, what I would call, collage of evidence of a bunch of different factors that sort of pin to this superstar firm story. Concentration is rising. It's where you see a bigger rise in concentration, you see a bigger fall in labor share, and it's really driven by the reallocation to the large firms that always had low labor share of value added, which you can see here in the blue part of this graph. Its aggregate markups are very much up, but it's not that the markup is up for the typical firm. So the markup is price cost margin in a sort of standard model. That's sort of monopoly power, intangible capital, but it's the weighted average markup it's the large firms' markups have gone up and they have bigger parts of the market. And when you see sort of the markup going up and the market share, it's associated with more innovative activity and more investments in IT. It isn't just looking like squeezing labor, it's somewhat uncorrelated. So our conclusion, you get very similar patterns of rise in concentration and decomposition. So to conclude, there's a very large decline in labor share, somewhat different timing in Europe and the US, and some more recovery in Europe. It's largely between firms, it's the growth of high-end, and it seems very compatible with an increasing dominance of large firms, which was initially technologically facilitated, but ex post, it's a very worrying sort of pattern in which you may think that we need to rethink antitrust in a world of changing sort of platform competition and incredible dominance of the large firms and the cloud of sort of labor. And so where I want to conclude is that I think that Tinbergen's race between education and technology framework, properly extended, is still as useful in the 21st century as it was in the 20th century. There are different dimensions, looking at the greater than college group, focusing on how to bring in micro foundations to it through things like models of task-based work and robots, thinking about integrating institutions and using new matched employer-employee data, and thinking about the big distribution questions between profits and labor, where I think a similar framework would come in. So I think at this 50th anniversary of Tinbergen's Nobel Prize, we are all in his debt for setting out a framework that I think speaks so much to many of the big issues we face today. So I want to thank you very much.